Hello, my name is Jonathan Humphreys. I am the head of the International Hotel Development, Asset Management and Finance Specializations at the Glion Institute of Higher Education. Welcome to Leading Hospitality Through Turbulent Times. This is the series entitled The World After 2020. This session will be a presentation of about 1 hour with 30 minutes for questions at the end. We're taking questions in writing only, and you can submit these as we go along. And just a reminder that the session will be recorded and be available on the Moodle platform afterwards. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our special guest today, Professor Yves Jamil, who is the Professor of Global and Comparative Politics at the University of Grenoble, from where he teaches online courses on international relations and diplomacy. He is truly a cosmopolitan and had his career across 6 countries and 4 continents. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Professor Yves Jamil.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be with you, if I can say with you. It's like, in an Asimov novel, which was published in 1957, The Naked Sun, and I come back to it later, in which people, humans, live on a very remote planet and they don't meet. Instead of meeting, they just have holograms because they are fearing contagion and they have to stay home. So we are nearly in the same position. But I'm glad to teach this course because it's probably time to reconsider quite a number of things that we assume to be true about international relations and global studies. And this is exactly what I've done for years, even for decades, doing research on international organizations, teaching in Geneva, a course on international relations as well. So I guess I'm very familiar with Switzerland and with students who come from all over the world. I taught in a number of universities as well. And so, although I am French, I'm not feeling so much as a French intellectual. I'm feeling as someone who taught in various countries, including Japan, United States, or Switzerland, and Lebanon as well, or Turkey and Egypt. Okay, now we are going to start this course, and I hope you will enjoy it. If it's a little difficult from time to time, don't panic. Go back to a number of concepts or statements that I make. From time to time I go in depth, and so we have also the chat session to reconsider things that may need clarification. So that's part 1, which is the whole week actually, and part 2 will be next week, etc. And there will be 2 sessions a week, as you know. Prelude to this course, we may ask 3 major questions. If you start discussing with people everywhere, one of the main topics of the conversation is that are people able to change their behavior, or are they sticking to their trends, to the way they behave, the way they think? Is this going to change? Of course, as I will show you in the next session, we cannot make prophecies about what will happen. We just try to elaborate some scenarios and see what is the most likely. But this is a question which will remain unresolved until the end of the course. And possibly we can try to solve that issue in the discussion. Next question, will international organizations replace states as sources of rules? You know what an international organization is. It's an organization which was created by international treaties and signed by a number of states. But there are also non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, like Oxfam, like Greenpeace, etc., and others which are we were established by or created by activists, by militants who wanted to advocate a cause. But most of the time when I say the international organization, sometimes IOs, it's just because I focus more on intergovernmental organizations than non-governmental organizations. And sometimes I make the distinction, sometimes I don't, so it might be a little misleading for you, but just focus on the idea that there are international organizations established by states, so they are intergovernmental organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, for example. Third question, will generous and altruistic international norms and regulations prevail over selfish national rules or not? The question is that, in theory and in history, by the way, states are supposed to behave according to the national interest and only the national interest. Now, make America great again, America first, etc. And that's taken for granted as an assumption. Then you may have variations according to the context. But the main idea is that from the earliest times to now, once you had states, then the states were selfish. The problem is that quite a number of problems that states are facing are now beyond their control, beyond their borders. You can remember, for example, that when Bill Clinton was on the verge of stepping out of his office, there was a big meeting of the International Monetary Fund in Washington. And so at the time, the head of the IMF was a French economist, and Clinton kindly invited him into his car and proposed to give him a drive towards the place where they met after that. And so the French head of the IMF thought that this was a unique opportunity to ask only one question to President Clinton. He said, "What will you regret when you leave the White House?" And Clinton immediately, without any delay, answered, "The pollution cloud over China." Meaning that this pollution, which was due to the fact that China became the world factory, was not a Chinese issue. It was an issue for the whole world, including those who were living across the Pacific. So that means that we need to have more altruistic norms. So just a second about what a norm is, because we come back to that later. There are values, things to which you believe deeply, and sometimes religious values or familial values, and things that you consider as being principles, leading principles which organize your life. And they also have things that you consider as being unavoidable, like everyone now is against smoking, which was not the case decades ago. So by now, non-smoking is a norm. And there also are rules, which are legal rules. They were voted and enacted by parliaments, for example. And this is a little difference which is interesting to understand, because most of the time at the stage we are now, worldwide, we have norms to which people somewhere, rulers, leaders, decision makers, don't fully believe, and they did not embody them as the values in the community in which they were born, but they are still respecting these norms, and these norms are not yet translated into legal rules, which will have a legal, will be enforceable everywhere in the world. And of course, the answer is that we can, because we can. Yes, we can. It's Obama's saying, of course, but yes, we can overcome these difficulties and take this crisis as an opportunity to reset the system. Resetting the system means that we are not going to deglobalize. We are not going to have degrowth. There are quite a number of people who are actually advocating for degrowth. And this is not quite new. It already happened in the 70s at the time where there was an energy crisis because of the price oil, which skyrocketed at the time. So this is not a story. But it's impossible to abandon the idea that we need growth, because if we don't have growth, then we can come back to a state of poverty, or at least a number of pockets of poverty and frustration, relative deprivation of a group of people who are feel frustrated because, or even cheated because they did not reach a stage in the economic development in which they would enjoy some sort of a better life and some welfare if needed. So we have to make this globalization become acceptable. That's what we did, making it acceptable. I'm not sure that people will all be satisfied with the outcome of globalization everywhere simultaneously, but I'm sure that they may think that it's fair, or it's probably fairer than it was in the past. So the new mantra, by people like me and other people who feel more cosmopolitan than entrenched into their national origin, is that we have to accept the idea that state will delegate more powers to international organizations. Quite a number of power can obviously not be delegated to an IO, like, for example, security. And if you have an army, you have your weapons, your technological developments, your secrets, I mean, you are not going to abandon all this and transfer it even to NATO when you are the United States or you are France or Germany. But you can delegate a number of powers. For example, in the current crisis, the early warning could be delegated to an international organization like the WHO, provided the WHO is not only relying on whatever the government of the country in which the initial contagion was observed will or will not, and quickly or not, pass this information on. We should also rethink economics, because we are in a perilous time, and possibly capitalism is not going to be fully abandoned, but is going to be reshuffled in a way, reformed and possibly improved, because there are quite a number of things which are going out of control. Actually, this is done from time to time by bankers, by people who are in finance, even by those who benefit the most of the, for example, price per share and distribution of profits at the end of a year, etc. Shareholders, but in a way, the reset will be much larger than what these people usually do when there is a crisis and they want to find solutions to avoid returning to a state of tension, for example, on markets or in the loans which are accepted by banks, etc. We should also prefer collaboration to competition. A competition is when two countries are vying for power or for recognition and are trying to have people or states joining them and supporting them in this type of conflict. If it's not a conflict, it's a competition, like a game. And So we have to accept the idea that collaboration entails quite a number of sacrifices, because if you collaborate, that means you have to delegate part of your competencies to an international organization, which will, in a way, monitor whatever happens on your territory, which will inspect some of your facilities. And you may note that, for example, if it's a nuclear weapon facilities, then this type of inspection is very invasive, but it can happen because the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna usually does that for some countries at the very least. We should also privilege quality to quantity. That means that we have a time where mass consumption was the only target. I mean, you wanted to people, and we as people, we wanted to go to supermarkets and buy things without any restriction. and we would like to have the income which would be necessary to do this. And of course, the combination of the basket of food or whatever that we would like to buy would be increasingly expensive. That's a possibility, but this also has quite a number of side effects, and the side effects are sometimes very harming, like pollution of the environment, say climate change, etc. So what we need to do now is to privilege quality. We understand that there are quite a number of masks, for example, that we can wear during this crisis, which are not at the level of safety that is expected. And so we are looking for quality for practical reasons, and because we want to survive. And we also are looking for safe products. We don't want to eat and drink things which are not edible or not enough good, but not edible. And quantity will probably be less of a target for a while. And some people will switch to the idea that they can buy whatever they want, even something they don't need, to things that are of value. And I remember the first time I went to the United States, I was accommodated by a teacher in the secondary school, and she had a kitchen in which the hardware was dating to the 50s probably, and but it still worked, and it was really built to work for forever probably. Maybe if I returned there by now, I would see the same type of hardware. And so, and last but probably not least, we should combine fairness and freedom. You can understand better this sentence if I tell you that at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, they inherited from the agreements on trade and tariff fees that were signed in the 40s and 50s, the idea that trade should be free, which means deregulated, which means you have to proceed to a disarmament of the custom taxes. But non-governmental organizations and people who lived in the global south protested against this. They said that what is better is that you have a fair trade, meaning that if someone is actually doing some trade with you, you should pay an equitable price, and they should not be pushed to do things which are harmful for their health, etc. So fairness means fair trade, and freedom means free trade. So now the WTO has this double motto, which is it's about fair and free trade altogether. This said, we can now go to our first point, which is it time for a reset? And the problematic behind this is that globalization may be stopped, but if it is stopped, we are all going to suffer from that. It's not exactly an opportunity to go back to times where people could not travel, where ideas were not mobile, etc. So, in my view, the answer is that we should actually ask ourselves this question. Is globalization going to be stopped by the pandemic? But the what, quotation mark, is much more important. There are other alternatives, there are other options, and there are other solutions. Let's start with globalization as a problem. It is a problem because it's viewed by a number of people as a source of division. Meaning that, you know, it probably increases the intensity with which states are fighting against each other, are trying to prevail in international negotiation, but it's also a source of division within states, within the populations of each state. Why? Well, globalization is about things which move, like fluxes, like demographic trend, like growth in the number of people, the people who are very young in the population, the composition of the population between young and more and aged people. It's about commodities, it's about goods, it's about services, it's about studying abroad, it's about quite a number of things which can be measured and which are usually represented on maps by arrows. But this time, because there were, of course, several waves of globalization in the past, but this time it's massive, it's intense, and in a way, it's a contraction of time and space. That means that you can do things nearly simultaneously in two very remote parts of the world, and you have the possibility to be informed whatever happened everywhere online when it happens or nearly after it have happened. So that's what globalization is, and in a way this is distinct because in the past it was not so massive, it was not so intense, of course it was not very fast. You would travel for a week to go to the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, for example, at the very best, and sometimes 2 or 3 weeks were needed. Globalization is also a source of contradictions because there are now people who are opposed to each other, whereas in the past they thought that they belonged to the same nation, that they were all having the same type of interests, the national interests was the same for each of them, which is not the case by now. There are winners, the anywhere, and losers, the somewhere, according to someone who's called David Goodhart, and I come to it in a minute. Let me have just a break for a couple of seconds. I have something to settle for a while. Okay, I'm back. Michael, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. We don't see you.
Thank you. So let's see. David Goodhart is someone who just go back and forth between the academia and the newspapers and the media networks, etc. And he's the author of very interesting books, which was out something like a year and a half ago, in which he makes this distinction between those who are from anywhere and those who are from somewhere. Those who are from anywhere, they are people who are cosmopolitans. They can their identity is to be a citizen of the world. They can live nearly everywhere, provided that they have an interesting job and rewarding, of course, position. And they learn, they are curious, they learn from the discovering other systems of thought and other systems, social systems, etc. What Goodhart says about them, that they tend to do well at school. So tending to do well at school doesn't mean that they are stars in the college or whatsoever, but most of the time they are good students, good pupils and good students. They place a high value on autonomy, mobility, and novelty. And that's what this makes them distinct from the somewhere, people who tend to think of themselves as left behind, thinking that the globalization process is not for them, that they won't get the whole benefit of the process, and probably they will pay the costs more than any other. These people are older, white, in Great Britain, mainly the field on which Goodhart made his essay, about which he made his essay. Working class men with little education. So you see, it works for Great Britain when you look at the outcome of the Brexit referendum, but it also work for the United States with Trump electors. People who are victims of some caricature saying that they are the rednecks because of the sun on their neck when they're doing agriculture. They are more socially conservative, meaning they're attached to family, for example, and not very keen at looking at gay marriage or whatsoever. And they are communitarian by instinct. You know, they want to belong to a community, local community, a community of people who are from the same social class or who speak the same language, because there are people who speak Scottish, people who speak English, people who speak Celtic, etc. And of course, in a country like the United States, Spanish and so on. By instinct, meaning that, you know, it comes from the guts. And this is the interesting fact about these people. 60% of British people still live, that's 2017, still live within 20 miles of where they lived when they were 14. That means that even in Great Britain, where the city of London is so much famous worldwide for being open to the whole world, where you see how so many different cuisines represented in restaurants, etc., then quite a number of people are still very much attached to their roots. Cosmopolitanism is, of course, what the Anywhere are trying to support. Actually, they endorse this ideology and they behave accordingly. And the Anywhere, the Somewhere, could be considered as neo-nationalists, the people who were not so much supporting the idea of their nation as being the best nation ever, etc., except in football games. But they are now coming back to the idea that probably their nation has something that the others have not. And in the Brexit campaign in Great Britain, it was quite clear that part of those who voted to leave the European Union were thinking with some nostalgia to the times where the Parliament of Great Britain was sovereign and their own rules were voted by their own people. If you translate this into a different vocabulary, which is the vocabulary of globalization, there are people who want to be integrated into the globalization process better than they already are. So they want their share of the cake and they want to contribute to the acceleration of the globalization process because they expect from this acceleration a lot of benefits from themselves. There are some people who, on the contrary, demand some protection from the globalization process. So they want to reach a stage of demarcation from strangers, meaning people who are not close to their community, but live within the same boundaries, and foreigners, those who live abroad. And that means that you would like, for example, not to have too many Mexicans in Southern California, or you don't want to have too many Polish workers in London, etc. This is a confrontation between two attitudes, two ideology, by the way, very structuring in someone's lives, but also in lifestyle. Because the lifestyles depend much on the goal that you think are the goals that you are pursuing in your life. What are your ambitions? What is your bucket list? The bucket list is the list of things that you would like to do before leaving this world. And so there is a bucket list, and probably golden boys in the city of London, or in Wall Street, or in Singapore, have a different type of bucket list than people who are tilling the land somewhere in Poland or in Hungary. So that makes people attached to quite different conceptions of life. It's not only about how much money I will make if I am really integrated into the globalization process and global markets. I can reach global markets. There was an ad which was very funny some time ago in black and white to show how old it can be, with a couple of middle-aged American tourists in Sicily, and they wanted to see if there was some olive oil to be sold in a very small farm remote from the main roads. They found out probably driving on a narrow road in Sicily. And so there is a woman in black, a very aged woman in black, who just came out of the house, climbed the stairs, come near the couple, the American couple, and said, "Do you want olive oil? Yeah, we sell it. We sell it on the internet. We sell it on Amazon. We sell it to Pittsburgh and to everywhere in the world." So that means that you may be integrated into the internet world, so you may benefit from this. But there are people who really don't want to accept this, and there are people who manage to keep their lifestyle as it was, like this Sicilian woman, for example, and their commerce more cosmopolitan. So we have different types of nuance. It's a nuanced list of possible attitudes and lifestyle, but it structures the whole life of the people. So we can ask ourselves, with future globalization, bring more interdependence between peoples or more solidarity within one people or across borders? So that means that we should ask questions like, will winners of globalization process accept to share with losers, or those who think they are losers, by the way, because they may be not, but they think they are losers. The feeling is important here. So will winners share with losers? Well, that's not guaranteed at all. If you look at the way some people try to make money out of the current crisis and do not at all consider as a parameter the fact that people are going to die if they if they earn more money in, for example, storing masks somewhere for a while until the price goes up. Well, we are not absolutely sure that it will go in that direction. Second question, will developed states, industrialized states, complex societies, and probably with constitutions, fundamental laws, which have checks and balances between political powers, etc., will these developed states share with developing countries, countries which are in the making, because composed of communities which were quite different at the very beginning, put together after colonization or decolonization, speaking different languages, etc., and having some sort of a weak economy, or economy grounded on very weak basis, like just a rent, like oil rent. And if you take Algeria, for example, 87% of the income of Algeria comes from oil and gas, and so if the price of oil and gas is dampened, well, what will happen to the budget? What will happen to the assistance that the state gives to a number of people, etc., social housing, health, and whatever. And the last question, probably the most important: are international organizations able to support sharing? If my answer is yes, as you can see here, they will support sharing because it's exactly the mandate they have. And the mandate is to redistribute whatever is worth of redistribution. Like if we have health, an acceptable level of health in the global north, then the global south should also get the same level of global wealth, global health, and sometimes possibly global wealth as well. And so international organizations are legitimate as far as they can show convincingly that they are concerned with the problems of the poorest and the problems of the weakest, as well as with the problems of the more powerful and the wealthier. Of course, national states will certainly be reluctant to share. Not all of them. There are states which are having some stake in showing that they are ready to share their welfare with others. Sometimes the Scandinavian states behave like this, or like people to think that they are behaving like this. Even the Chinese government in the current crisis did something which was much rather close to this with the export of health protection wear, etc., to the rest of the world. But this is, of course, more or less diplomacy, soft power, whatsoever. I mean, a way to look more legitimate to others. But it's probably not a real will to share whatever you have as a distinctive asset compared to other countries in the world. National states are therefore building international organizations because they cannot do without, especially they want to address some issues which go cross-border and across generations in the long run, very, very long run, whereas politicians most of the time are just looking for the next election, whatever the election is, even if it's an election in an authoritarian country in which you are elected with 95% of the vote, but there are still some period of time which are delicate even for dictators. So national states and international organizations do not have the same time horizon. What we know about that is that when there is a world crisis and where states are not successful in trying to address the issues which are rising at the time, neo-nationalism is propelled. It is fueled by this crisis. Neo-nationalism means that there are quite a number of people who think, contrary to what they probably thought decades ago, that half a century ago it was better to be a nationalist than today to be a cosmopolitan, because nations were places where people were really eager to help each other and or accept to share their revenues in order to, for example, fund the welfare for those who have not. Cosmopolitanism, on the other hand, is boosted by success stories. I mean, there are a number of success stories in the economy in the economies of a number of countries. You see that even in Bhutan, for example, when they invented the idea of gross national happiness. It's the idea that growth doesn't make people very happy, but there is some sort of a growth which is happening there, and people have also success story to tell. And so when you look, that people somewhere are setting benchmarks because their behavior is really rewarding for their own people and it should be rewarding for the whole world, then they will just pick out this as an example and say, this is what we try to imitate elsewhere. So there are success stories and can be taken as benchmarks. But there are also international organizations' achievements. We should not forget that even in the current crisis where the World Health Organization is so much criticized, and it had been criticized in the past on various grounds in other pandemic, the very idea behind this is that in a way they succeeded in having some early warning system, to have a list, as we will see in the next session, of things to do, the protocol, and all this did not exist 15 years ago. So it's something very recent, which shows that they, in a way, improved their own status in the monitoring of a health crisis. But there are other success stories as well. I mean, you may, for example, say that the World Food Programme is successful in bringing food in periods where people are just starving in a place or another, despite the fact that the staples, the price of the staples and the price of the cargoes have skyrocketed for decades, and that it's more and more difficult to bring things at an acceptable price and quickly to places where people need it, otherwise they would die. And there are other examples as well. We have no time to go into detail, but if you are interested in this, we can have some other examples in the discussion. And the interesting fact is that because they are made to produce norms, I mean things which should be our goals, our ambitions, and we should all behave according to these ambitions, which are translated into mottos like education for all, internet should be accessible to all, there should not be any digital divide, and so on. So IOs yield actually much more, many more norms than states do, because states can do with, for example, in a particular field, something like a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozens of laws, whereas you will find the paramount norm or two in an international organization, which will be at the root of all these local laws. I'll give you an example of that. When China accessed the World Trade Organization, it had to change for one day to the next 45 national laws in order to be consistent with the commitments made at the WTO and signed into the 27,000 pages of treaties that at that point the new candidate, once admitted, should ratify. So the conflicts, the competition, or even not a war, I mean, in a sense, but I mean, it's just a pseudo war between national states in international organization, mean that there is some sort of conflict between sovereignty and intergovernmentality. Sovereign countries are countries where the political system has or is supposed to have control over anything which happens within the country. Intergovernmental bureaucracies which behave according to whatever bureaucracy is. I mean, bureaucracy is about hierarchy. It's about instructions which go from the top to top down. It's also about division of labor. It's also about the possibility to climb the stairs and the positions and reach a higher position when you end your career than when you started. It's and neutrality. You don't care much about who is asking what. I mean, it's just depending on the efficiency of your activity. And sometimes, of course, justice is also important to make decisions. But I mean, all this is weighed by people who are supposed to be servicing the whole community in their own country. And now, if it's an intergovernmental bureaucracy in the whole world. So if you are an agent of the WHO, even though you are an Ethiopian physician, you think that you are servicing the whole world. You are no longer servicing only the Ethiopian. And in this conflict, the winner is obviously international organization, because they make norms which are paramount norms, which are stronger than local norms. And for example, responsibility to protect is an invention made at the level of the United Nations Security Council. But the idea of the responsibility to protect is quite the contrary of the norm on which was an interstate norms at the time, on which in 1945, when the UN was established, was the rule, which means non-intervention in the affairs of any country which is a member of the United Nations. So if you are a member of the United Nations, no other member is able to say anything about what happens within your state. Now, the responsibility to protect means that the UN or NATO or any other force can be strongly encouraged and probably very legitimate in having a military action against a party which is bringing some trouble or strife or even civil war somewhere in the world, anywhere in the world, I should say. I give you an example of such norms, and of course, norms about gender are the norms which come to the mind for various reasons. You know, basically, there is a UN idiom which is not very easy to understand, and people just repeat it without completely knowing what it means, which is called gender mainstreaming. Which means actually that whatever you do, whatever the decisions you make, you have to take into consideration the fact that it has an impact on the balance of power between genders, or it has an impact on the way gender issues are conceived. So you should, in any decision you make, public decision, policy measures, you should just figure out what will be the impact of that decision on the relationship between men and women, between heterosexuals and others, and so on and so forth. And so you have two types of extreme norms which are represented here. On the left, you have the design in which the gender equality is the goal, full gender equality. And then you have a number of fields or realms in which this gender equality should be pursued. It should be an objective, and probably there are priorities. For example, if you are in the business sector, women and men should be paid exactly the same if they have the same position within the firm. In power, there is a parliament, 50% of the elected people in the parliament should be women, etc. About knowledge, I mean, there is no question about the fact that girls should go to school and attend school with the same level, at the same proportion compared to boys, and so on. Violence, well, it's not. I don't think it's very necessary to elaborate. But that means that it has been detailed, and for each of these circles and color, you have a number of other issues that are listed somewhere. And if you are interested in this, if you are, for example, a minister of tourism somewhere in the country of the global south, relying very much on people who come for summer resort every year, then you should find out, if you take a measure, what kind of impact it will have on the gender balance. Now, on the right, you have something which is a capture of a post in a public lavatory somewhere in the United States. And you know that a number of states in the United States finally prohibited the distinction between men and women in the restrooms, because that means that you believe in the distinction, which is natural. And so people don't want to accept this. They want to be neutral. And that the problem is that now there are quite a number of people who should share the same restrooms, which might be an issue for women compared to men, for example, but not only. So that's my introduction. At that point, I'm not sure, Michael, or Jonathan, that you've seen a number of comments or discussion made on the chat session. But if there are, I'm ready to react.
Yves, there's two questions sitting there in the chat, which you can look at on the right-hand side.
Okay. So okay, for the question about the developing countries and the developed countries, it is clear that we'll see. We better understand this in the next session. So I'm just skipping it for the moment, but it's an accurate question, actually. Thank you for asking it. And the East-West position between the East and the West, which disappeared or was assumed to have disappeared after 89 and 91. It's not going to be translated into a US-China opposition. Of course, it would be very long to develop this, but actually, the Cold War is over as such. So you may try to assimilate what's happening between the rivalry between China and the United States by now to what happened in the Cold War between the United States and the USSR, but it won't be true, because it won't be correct, because there was a real balance of power between the two. The mutual deterrence system, for example, helped them to have a rather stable balance between their military powers and we escape the gloomy perspective of having a nuclear war. And then once the war was over, the idea that capitalism as the driving force behind the economy is unavoidable in a way or another, gained momentum everywhere in the world, even in China. Now, the Chinese, many times in history, and even during Deng Xiaoping times, they said that they were not the candidates to being the most prominent country in the world. I mean, they were not. They didn't feel responsible for whatever happened somewhere in the world, only what had an impact on their own development and interest. And so that meant that probably the United States, if they wish to do this, and they had the capabilities to do it, would continue to try to police the world if there were troubles somewhere, like in Palestine, like in the Indian subcontinent or elsewhere, and in Central Africa. But the Chinese wouldn't be in. They wouldn't be counted in as belonging to the countries which have a particular responsibility, collective responsibility. So, of course, that means that it's enough for most rulers in China to focus on the idea that they should be prominent in their region, which is Asia. So there they are very eager not to be in conflict, in a position of deficit of power with any of the existing power or the powers which are emerging power in the area. And so it's a different type of competition. The competition between China and Russia was balanced and dangerous. The competition between the United States and China, so far, is a competition in which there is some sort of a division of labor between the two, and the Americans, for the moment, probably until Trump, and we don't know what will come out of the next election and what will follow. But probably until Trump, they accept the idea of some sort of a double bind. One, they have to accept that they are the leader of the whole world and they have things to do in order to behave accordingly. But they also are Americans and who think that their nation is the best nation of the world. And so, between quotation mark, and so it's the elected people in the most acceptable political system, etc. So if you really want to be better off, just go there and migrate and become American. So that's a double bind, because Trump obviously shows that it's very difficult to handle all this simultaneously. Either you send troops to Afghanistan, or you focus on the welfare of people who live in a disaffected industrial area of the United States. I'm not sure I have answered the whole question, but I'm sure that in the future, you'll get your answer. You get the full answer. All right.
Just one thing, Yves. Can you turn on your camera? I don't know if you're having challenges with the camera.
Oh, sorry. I forgot about the camera. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. So yes. Well, you heard me. Probably the students who had these questions heard me, I guess.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's return to the course by now. All right. Section 1.1 in this time to reset. The problem is that we relied on exchange and mobility. This is exactly what made this period very, very distinct compared to others, as people were very mobile, and that the exchanges were happened in every field, and a lot of various people, very different from each other, started to travel, to connect to the rest of the world, etc. So it's not sure that it will be possible to change this once we recover from the current health crisis, and once we find ways not to be affected by a new wave of this virus or any other type of pandemic. So this is a big question. So by exchange, I mean that you may, for example, be a street demonstrator in Cairo in 2011, and you are connected by the internet and your smartphone to someone else in the United States or in Indonesia, and you start having a debate about what's happening on a square in central Cairo. And this is immediate. I mean, there is only a second of time lag between what you may just record with your smartphone and people who see whatever happens to you, and you may get advices from people who are very remote from the central square of Cairo. So that's what exchange is about. The Erasmus exchange, or the exchange of students between universities of two countries or two regions, are also exchange of this kind. But there's also an exchange of good and of know-how, an exchange of, if you have a patent, for example, for a new invention, you protect it for a number of years, usually 20 to 25 years, and then after that, it becomes grandfathered, and at that point, anyone can produce the same good with your instructions, actually, which are well known and archived somewhere, like the World International Property Organization in Geneva, for example, and then you can use it at a low cost and sell it for nearly nothing to a number of people who need it, like a drug. And mobility is mobility of the capacities that people have to settle in another country than their own, to learn the language, to probably get the citizenship of a new country, if they keep the original citizenship, they will be now binationals, and so on. So this is the question. Let's see what the answer is. Well, the answer is collaboration. We cannot do it on our own. Nobody and no state, even the most powerful, can handle these issues alone. You can just figure out what would happen if, for example, the British would be left with their natural health system, to which they are so much attached, by the way, and which was a benchmark for the whole world, including France, social security system. If Brexit, when Brexit is really actual, because by now, as you know, they are discussing what will happen with Brexit, exactly what would be the impact of Brexit on a number of commitments, mutual commitments of the European Union and the United Kingdom. So far we are in some sort of, it's not a no man's land, but it's a non very much ruled zone, and also it's very recent, so we don't see exactly the impact of this leaving the European Union on the national health system of Great Britain. But it's possible that belonging to the European Union means that, for example, at least as far as the economy is concerned, a number of grants, loans, a number of funds which would accrue to firms in difficult times, etc., will be, of course, on a higher scale at the level of the European Union compared to the level of the United Kingdom. So the NHS is probably not able to catch up with the pace of change and improvement in the whole European Union. In the USA, suspending the contribution to the WHO is, of course, just a signal sent to first people who rule the WHO, but also the people who criticize the WHO and who want it to be reformed. And the Americans by now are trying to reform each organization one by one, like the WTO and the UN and others. So if they just stop funding the WHO, it's a matter of $500 million, so it's not that much for the moment, if it won't last for long. But if they stop contributing to the WHO, there can be something which backfires, and in the end, decade possibly, when historians are starting to make some sort of an assessment of what really happened at the of crisis, then it may appear that there were many more people who died because of that than if the USA had been much more cooperative than they are by now. But if you look at the Italians, who were so much plagued by the pandemic, and among the first to suffer from this, there are a number of people who were very much committed to Europe. They were very supportive of Europe. Don't forget that Italy, with Germany and France, they were the three countries which are the root of the European Union, as we know it by now. But I mean, they were the engines of the European Union. So that the Italians think that they are sidelined. Probably there is some despise or mistrust whatsoever at the level of at least the Germans and people of Central Europe, etc. And so they are very much frustrated about the lack of assistance from the European Union, or the time lag taken to decide on which kind of assistance they could benefit. And so there are quite a number of Italians, according to the polls, who are now prepared to leave the Eurozone, to come back to the lira, or even to leave the European Union. And that's probably because collaboration has been lacking at the most needed time, where it should have occurred as some sort of a common good of the European Union. Why? We need collaboration. We need collaboration to, now please, I know you may be a little tired after this long introduction, and we are beginning now to enter into actually the deepest content of this first part. So I want you to focus as much as you can. Please, I try to be very explicit, but you know, it's not easy to be clear with such very ambitious concepts. Because at the level of the world, what is produced, like peace or health, is a global public good. It's a good which is not private, which has no market value, and which has to be produced for everyone in the world simultaneously. So who can do that? I mean, certainly not the state, and certainly not the weakest states that exist on this planet. So someone should produce this good, and so far there is no alternative but to delegate this capacity to international organization. Like, for example, if you want to look to fight against starvation, you need a program of the United States, the World Food Program, to do that. If you want to provide food and goods to everyone in the world, help them to till the land the most efficiently they can, so you need to have a global public good. So here is a definition of a public good. It's not the public harm. A public harm is the pollution over China, which slightly went over Japan, Vietnam, and other countries in the world, and the United States as well, as I mentioned previously. Deforestation in the Amazonia is of course a problem, as you have seen. The ozone layer can be affected by that. And the basics about the global public good is that you can use it, consume it, and nobody is going to be deprived of this possibility to have this good too. So it's not a cake that you are going to share with the largest and tiniest shares of the cake. It's a cake that is always re-provisioned, and so it's a miracle in a way. A road, for example, can be used by someone who drives on the road and by many others who will drive on the road, and those who don't drive might at some point like to drive on the same road. So that's exactly what the global public good is. It's a complex notion, so I'm going to skip this, but I want you to read it carefully, because economists have some basic criteria to distinguish a global public good from any other. And so if you have questions about that, we can come back to it, but I skip this slide. And I come to another criteria, which is that it's transnational good, because it's global. It's global because it's transnational, it's cross-border. Delivered by a global institution, because it's across border. And for example, the possibility to communicate as we is a global public good. Because wherever you can see me, you can hear me, I cannot see you, and I can hear you. But I mean, we are connected. And this is because the International Telecommunication Union, whose headquarters are in Geneva, is able to make this communication possible with a technical standard and with any other conditions that should be met before we can connect. And so that's a global institution. You can imagine that states cannot each on its own, at its own hand, decide separately to elaborate standards, and it would work. If you look at the electricity hardware and plugs, for example, which vary from the state to Japan to Europe, etc., and you see what would be the problem. So intergovernmental organizations only can provision such goods, and there is no alternative. And if you look at NGOs like Greenpeace, for example, for the environment or climate change, well, the only thing they can do is to help, but they cannot do this themselves. They can trigger a discussion, a public debate about a global public good which is needed and not provided in enough quantity or with enough quality. But in the long run, the intergovernmental organizations prevail. There are two different types of global public goods, primary and secondary. A primary global public good is a good without which the other good cannot be provided. Health is obviously of the kind, because if you are not healthy, if your condition is bad, and if you are suffering from any type of disease, if you are sick, then there will be a number of things that you won't be able to do, like exporting or importing, like inventing, like having a new patent on technological innovation, like living in peace. Well, living in peace, if you die from the pandemic, I mean, doesn't mean much. So, you know, this is the condition which is the primary condition. Without health, you won't go further. And health can be just, in a way, dispatched between things that you need to be in a good condition and people who can help, and structures that will be very helpful in order to make you live as healthy as possible. Now, a secondary global public good unfolds from this, the availability of primary goods. People are in good health. Most of them are in good health in the population. Then this population is better equipped to catch up with progress, whatever the progress is, economic progress mainly. And mobility depends heavily on the capacity to first elaborate laws which make people able to be mobile and move from one place to the other, because without this, without agreement on visas, for example, and how people are addressed, they travel from one country to the next and then re-travel to the third one, etc. Without that, there is no mobility. And so either domestic mobility from one place to another or cross-border mobility depends on the fact that there are quite a number of rules, and also that people have no feud about what being healthy means. Because if you just take off in Zurich and you just land in Pittsburgh and someone tells you that you are not able to be accepted within the United States, you have to go back, this is a problem. Health conditions mobility and also conditions leisure. Of course, people who are having fun anywhere in any type of activity should be in good health. Otherwise, it should be banned from casinos, from spas, from swimming pools, from beaches, from ski resorts, or wherever. But also, they won't be able to go to watch movies or go to a theater, etc. So health is considered as being a common good, or a commons, to speak the British vocabulary of the economists of the 18th, 19th century, like Adam Smith and others, Stuart Mill. It's a commons. It belongs to anyone. It's the place that you cannot own yourself, and you cannot, certainly not, enclose this place and say it's mine, and you have no access except if you pay, for example, to accede to a common pool, a place where cattle can graze. This was the case historically in England. It's accessible to all. internet is accessible to all. But there are quite a number of conditions that you have to meet before you are able to access to anything and to anyone. But in principle, it's accessible to all. And it's also a right. It's a right because you have a right to health. You have a right to be in good condition without being infected by a traveler, without being infected by someone who does not respect the rules of hygiene, who is not committing and not actually implementing the rules that are settled, that are set by international organizations about the quality of food and the safety, food safety. So it's a really basic right. I see that I'm talking too much, but it's because the first class and we have a long introduction. So I'm going to get through and we make a break for discussion. Health is not only health as such, it's also mental health, for example. If people are suffering from a number of psychological disease, of course, they are not good economic agent. They are not good spectator and consumers of culture, and they are not good learners. And probably, if some of you are not in good condition today, it's probably more difficult for those who feel well to follow my class until the end and being as focused as the others. So the global public good is promoting a healthy physical and mental condition. So what kind of institutions can do that? Well, the WHO can reach such a condition, the Food and Agriculture Organization and many others, and we will see this in the next session. So you cannot be completely happy and healthy if others are not. That's something obvious, trivial. I shouldn't be compelled to repeat this, but we have to repeat it in our mind, otherwise we shall forget and probably we skip it, whereas it's very important. So how to combine health and mobility, health as a primary global public good and mobility as a secondary global public good, successfully? Well, we have to understand that we are living in critical conditions by now. And it's not that we are all in critical physical condition or mental condition as a body or as a mind ourselves, going to hospitals to be treated and cured, but it's because the context is perilous. Transportation is a problem. I mean, myself I've been confined for nearly 50 days, and I'm worrying about how I'm going to use public transportation, for example, when needed, to go to Paris and have meetings there, and then go from one place to the next in Paris, for example, whereas here I can drive my car. And then if we want to adapt to critical conditions, instead of complaining that we are living in a world which is for the moment, for the time being, so critical that we cannot consider anything else but living in our home until it ends and it's over, well, no, it's going to be probably critical in a way or another, at some level or another, for a long period of time. And there are other sorts of critical conditions than health. So we have to forecast the future as we can, and this is exactly what we shall do in the next session, when in the next class. So I'll make a break by now, again, and if you have questions, questions can be recorded in the meantime, and all is yours.
Yves, there's a few questions down the right-hand side. If when you take the questions, if it's possible to click the publish button and then the audience can see them.
Okay. Okay. Areas where it will, that's for one of the next sessions, where it will be safe to invest. The new venues, new places, risk assessment. That's for the next session. Okay, Keynesian theories. Okay, yeah. I'm not sure everyone is fully aware of who John Maynard Keynes was, a British economist who became famous because he criticized the way classical economy in England and Scotland after the end of World War I were addressing the issue of post-war economy and recovery. And so he said that the idea that you just let the market work and you will return to a situation where everyone will be well was completely it was not a correct assumption. So he said that you have to invest a lot of liquidity into the markets in order to make people able to recover, and that's why he criticized the post-war commitments that the German had made to the victors of World War I, and that they would give them a lot of money as a compensation for the losses that they were at the roots of which they were because they started the First World War themselves. And so he said, if we do this, the Germans are going to be ruined. And the only thing which will happen is a contraction of the markets everywhere, and everyone is going to lose. So he said we have to invest a lot of money. Now, the problem is that he even said that you have probably heard of the helicopter money, the money that you distribute from the air by banknotes that you just redistribute to people who just pass by and try to catch notes of, and appropriate these banknotes if they are lucky enough. Well, this is one of the aspects of theory, but in his book, the main book, which was written after that, in the 30s, the end of the 30s, for the beginning of the 40s, Keynes said that you should possibly, for example, burn a number of bottles filled with banknotes and pay the worker for doing this, and then pay the worker to just extract these bottles from the ground and redistribute it to the people. So the idea is that you should pay people for doing things which are not on demand on the market. It's exactly what is needed by now. Now the problem is that after a while, people fully understood that Keynesianism is an appropriate economic policy within the national state boundaries. I mean, if you do that, for example, in Switzerland, all people who live in Swiss will benefit from this. Now, if you do this and competitors in, for example, Ethiopia, still continue to be paid to get a very low salary and very poor security, social security systems, etc. So in the end, there is some sort of a social dumping or a currency dumping or whatever, and so the Swiss are going to lose, all of them. So the idea is that when the world is becoming more open, Keynesianism is no longer possible. Now, by now, with the current crisis, you are right to point out that possibly we may rethink or reconsider this assumption about Keynesianism. But I'll give you an example of that later too. Okay, let's move on. How could we hold institutions accountable? Okay. That's also a big issue, of course. Thank you for raising such challenging questions. It's fun for me, actually. It's very pleasant. Okay, accountancy is really a problem for a number of people. You see, I'm losing the question. Where is it? So let's publish. I can see only the published issues. Why? Now I can come back to it. Wow, only the last one which appears. Why? Michael, you know why I'm not seeing the formerly published questions to which I started to answer, and I get only the newest one.
There's a tab right at the top next to new. They should be published. So you can click on that.
Yes,
click on
here it is.
Yes.
No, I clicked on it, but it didn't work so far because I didn't click at the right place exactly. Okay, so accountability. Accountability is, of course, a concept which entails an economic aspect, like accountancy and the accounts, correct accounts, honesty and sincerity, etc. And there are also a political responsibility input, which is we promise things, did we deliver, etc. And so it's, of course, very much promoted by Western democratic countries as such. But it becomes fashionable everywhere because, you know, you might not like to be accountable home because you live in a very authoritarian system and you are a very authoritarian ruler, but you would like the United States to be accountable for things they do or don't do, which have an impact on you. So at the level of an international organization, you will ask for accountability. So accountability is not an issue. The only problem is the implementation of accountability beyond just the economic accounts. And political accountability is, of course, the issue, and it's becoming more and more actually addressed correctly within the international organization. I know, by the way, I didn't have an opportunity to say, but I know something like, I've been working on something like dozens of such organizations, probably 80. So a pretty idea of how it works in various contexts. Now, delegating more powers to them, yes, it affects developing countries because the main motivation of bureaucrats within this organization is to make sure that people who come from the global south feel well treated and not cheated by the system. So since the system was conceived by the global north and for a long period of time worked to accommodate people from the east and people from the west, and now this divide has disappeared, but what has not disappeared is that the division between north and south, globally speaking, because Australia is global north within the south, but north and south, to speak like this, and this big divide has to be erased by whom? By bureaucrats who work within international organizations. So this is their main concern all the time. I can assure you, every time you go there, visit them, interview them, they say that a good policy is a policy which will be endorsed by people from the south. Okay, I guess if we saw UN laws and other international laws being broken, well, it will happen again, for sure. I mean, even if we had the world government, which is a possibility in, say, 100 years from now, I have good arguments to support this idea, but I'm not going to develop them by now. But if we had it in the long run, then laws will be broken from time to time anyway. There's no way out. But what you need is to have a capacity to make this law enforced most of the time. Even within a country, I mean, laws are not always implemented or enforced. When there are quite a number of laws which are laws on paper, but people don't behave according to them. Until, for example, the government start discussing the possibility to make them enforced better than they were. What tools does an IO have to impose it to big players? Well, big players, I mean, the big players have a stake in having these international organizations maintained and being able to deliver whatever they expect from them. So they have to accommodate, get along together, make compromises, and also for that they need support from allies and sometimes from tiny countries, which most of the time do not matter much in the negotiation process. But on a specific issue like producing cotton production or on the problem of a patent, a particular patent in medicine or whatsoever, are very important countries for the success of the negotiation. So that's part of the answer. Now, there are, of course, organizations which have such tools like WTO, which has a dispute settlement mechanism with an appellate body, and in the end, countries are condemned to suffer from retaliation in higher taxes on products and services which were not taxed so far. And even in the internet, for example, in the internet, if you try to cheat and use my name to have an email address and develop your own business of online courses, for example, what will happen is that at the level of the World Intellectual Property Organization, there is an arbitration center, and in this arbitration center, someone will try to make a judgment between you and me, and in the end, I guess I will win over you, because you would be, in that particular case, only trying to use my name to do things which have nothing to do with my own activity. And so this happened, by the way, the most famous case is the Julia Roberts case, because Julia Roberts has, of course, an email address, and she also has lawyers, and good lawyers. And so at some point, they found out that someone in Mexico used a Julia Roberts address for his own business. So there was a prosecution in Geneva online. And in the end, despite his protest, he said, you know, my name is Julia Roberts, so I'm sorry, but this is my family name, so I use Julia Roberts in Spanish. It's not Julia Roberts, the actress. And of course, he lost his case, so he lost his internet address, he's lost his internet connection, it's IP, so he lost his possibility to connect to the World Web. So there are tools. NATO has weapons, and we bombed Libya, and with the support of NATO a number of years ago, in 2013, if I remember well. So you see, there are a number of tools, and there are tools that you don't know. For example, the inspections by a number of these international organizations are very, very frequent. And also, one big tool that most people ignore, actually, is that even when there is no way to enforce a regulation at the international level, you still have to report on how you envisage or you plan to enforce or better enforce such or such rule. And for example, I can tell you that the Chinese are very much frustrated, because every year they have to report on the way their economy and their commerce is adapting to the commitments they made when they entered within the WTO years ago, a decade ago by now, and they are still under review every year, whereas the Swedish, for example, are reviewed every 5 years, which is the normal procedure of the WTO. So even the Chinese has to compel with very harsh rule, and they complain because they think that these rules are harsher for them than for all of us. All right. And I'm not sure I answered all the questions. We still have 2 minutes. Let me find out. Let me find out if there is something I didn't develop enough. Brexit. Well, of course. Well, no, it's not that easy actually to answer this question, Brexit and trade tariffs, because it's obvious that the tougher Brexiters in Great Britain want to have an advantage in trade, and they want to benefit from low trade tariffs or no tariffs at all. So they will still be committed to the World Trade Organization, for example, and all the agreements that they already have signed, except that they have to sign them again. So again, 27,000 of treaties. I mean, it will take a long period of time to review all this line by line. But the British are attached to that. But what they don't want is the additional rules, like rules about the budget, rules about spending, public spending, rules about fiscal taxation, and a number of things like this. So in a way, they are in a divided self type of condition, because they want to keep the benefit of the trade opening and deregulation, and at the same time they want to retrieve the situation where they will be able not to be constrained by the laws of the European Union. So we don't know what will come out. It depends on the final agreement that is still in the offing. Gender balance, and well, that would take longer than it's probably time is up, I guess. What do you do? What should we do, Michael?
Feel free to take one or two questions, or one question to finish things up. We should be thinking about finishing up the webinar, but there's no hard stop on our side.
Okay, so I finished with this gender issue, which for me probably is one of the most important, actually. So there is a direct impact of the gender balance on business. The direct impact is that you cannot do quite a number of things that were absolutely undebatable in restaurants, for example, or in hotels. Meaning that women would have less prominent roles. They would not rule. They not belong to the top management. They would wear the clothes that show that they are second-rate employees and so on. And they will receive orders and instructions, and there would be less women in the top management circle than at the bottom, like in kitchens, etc. That's an anecdote, but some years ago, I had a MOOC, which is unfortunately no longer online, on a British platform called Future Learn, and this MOOC was about the politics and diplomacy of cooking and hospitality. And so there were some steps within this MOOC where I had to discuss this gender issue. And I can assure you that the number of comments I received was huge compared to other issues, because a number of women complained about the fact that, for example, if I said cook or chef, this was probably the sign that there was some sort of an imbalance, a gender imbalance within my own mind, or possibly because I was inheriting this or unconsciously inheriting this type of distinction, and the natural character of distinction between men and women in cooking. Chefs are those who are 3-star chef, Michelin chef, etc. And cooks are those who are in the family kitchen cooking for their husband and for their sons, daughters. But of course, this was not what I had in mind. But the very idea that people could focus on this shows that even if you have a private business, you may be directly affected by the fact that you cannot give any sign of some complacency between for the gender issues, or ignorance or neglect for such issues. But it's also indirectly affected because, for example, the best example I have is once the UNDP was prepared to give a large amount of funding to the Ministry of Tourism in Morocco, say probably 10 to 12 years ago. And so UNDP had only one condition. You should, each time you make a proposal about a prospective policy measure, you should first check what kind of impact it will have on the gender balance. So for each policy measure, like we have a school for training guides for the museums, or we are going to give money to the hotel on the beaches, beach resorts to develop a certain type of spa or whatsoever. Each time you have to wonder what kind of impact it will have on the balance issue, the gender balance issue. So that's an example of an indirect impact of international organizations and public institutions on private business. And I guess I'll leave you with this, if Michael agrees.
Absolutely, I think that's it's a good place to finish off, and gets us ready for your next session.
Okay, so next session is Thursday, I guess.
Yes.
Same time, same place. Goodbye, everyone.